Hey, what's up, Resurface? Today I'm going to show you a quick and easy way of removing and replacing your front disc brake pads and rotors. Now, I'll be performing this repair on this 2001 Hyundai Elantra, but front disc brakes are pretty much all similar across all sorts of different makes and models, if not exactly the same. So first things first, we're going to raise and support the front of the car in jack stands and then remove our front wheels. Now, in order to be able to remove both our brake pads and our rotor, we're going to have to remove a total of 4 bolts that are in the back of this assembly. And in order to get easier access to those bolts, we're going to get in our car and turn our wheel all the way to the left. Alright, here's a look at our caliper bolts, which are these two guys right here, and here's our caliper. But before we remove these bolts and remove our caliper, here's a good tip. Alright, when it comes time to reassemble things, you're going to have to press in your piston that's inside your brake caliper to create more space here in order to be able to fit your new brake pads, which are going to have more meat on them than your old ones, and also your new brake rotor. And what usually people use to press in their brake caliper piston is either a large C-clamp or a special brake tool that they use that goes inside the brake caliper itself, and then they screw it in and then press in the brake piston. But here's what I do, and I'll demonstrate this on this caliper from a Chrysler PT Cruiser. I get a long, strong screwdriver or a pry bar, stick it in here, and then I use the rotor and the brake pad to press in the piston that's inside our brake caliper. I just basically stick it in like this, then twist it, and that presses in the rotor and the brake pad against the piston, and it pushes the piston all the way in. The trick is to make sure you push in the piston all the way in as much as you can. That way when it's time to reassemble, you don't have to wrestle with this brake caliper here with the C-clamp and try to twist it in to get it all the way in. It's already been done, and reassembly is going to be a breeze. But before we press in our piston, we're going to open up our brake fluid reservoir. Also, if there's been brake fluid added to this reservoir without replacing brake pads, then you might want to consider siphoning out some brake fluid, because as you press in the piston, the fluid that's behind the piston is going to come back up inside this reservoir. You're going to have too much brake fluid, and your brake fluid is going to overflow and dirty up your engine bay. So you either want to remove some brake fluid or at least keep an eye on it. Alright, here we go. And it's probably a good idea to go slow and steady. Alright, and now we can remove our caliper bolts. Alright, but before I remove the caliper, I like to get a bungee cord, throw it over the spring in the strut, and then when I remove this, I like to attach it to this. That way it's not dangling by this brake line. Alright, next we can remove our brake pads. And as you can see, we have hardly any braking material left on these pads. And you may need to use a flathead screwdriver to pry these out. There we go. Alright, next, in order to be able to get our brake rotor out of here, we're going to remove these 2 bolts that attach our brake caliper bracket to our steering knuckle. And these guys are going to be on nice and tight, so you might need a pry bar for this. Alright, here comes our bracket, and here comes our rotor. Next, we'll grab our rotors and go to our local garage or even O'Reilly Auto Parts stores. We'll resurface these for you if you live in the States. And what they're going to do is measure the thickness and compare it to the minimum allowed thickness that's usually stamped inside your rotor somewhere. And then they'll be able to tell you whether you can resurface these or not. And if you can, there's no reason why you shouldn't resurface these, and that way you don't have to go buy new ones. Alright, now it's time to clean and lube things up. First thing I'm going to do is these guide pins for a caliper. We just pull on them, and you might have to get the rubber boot off the caliper first. Then you pull it out. Next, you remove the boot from the pin. Next, you get a rag and some brake clean and thoroughly clean your guide pins. And you want to get these really smooth and clean, and if you see any rust or any damage or excessive corrosion, you want to go ahead and replace these. Alright, but before we can put the rubber boot back over this and put this back on our bracket, we need to lube this up. And I like to use Sil-Glide for lubrication. This is a silicone-based grease that's not going to damage the rubber boot that goes around this. If you use petroleum-based grease, there's a potential that it can eat away at the rubber boot that goes over these. Alright, next we'll slide on our rubber boot. And next we'll slide on our guide pin back into the bracket. Just make sure if you got old, dried up grease inside here, you want to get some brake clean and clean that out as well. Make sure this rubber boot seals properly. Alright, next up our brake hardware. Again, spray these with some brake clean and use a rag to thoroughly clean them. Make sure you get all the old dried up grease and gunk and brake dust off of these. And to clean these up, you can either use a wire brush or a Scotch Brite pad will do as well. Alright, next we'll put these back on the caliper bracket. Alright, so you want to spend a couple of minutes and clean these couple of areas on your brake calipers as well. You want to clean these two areas. These are going to come in contact with the back of one of your brake pads. Also, the top of your piston needs to be cleaned as well. Alright, next we get our brake rotor that we just got machined back on. And we use a couple of our lug nuts to keep it in place. And I know this is not machined. The owner of this car didn't want to spend the money to get these machined if they're still within spec as far as the thickness goes. But you should definitely try to get yours machined before you put it back on. Alright, so next we get our caliper bracket and we're going to reattach it to our steering knuckle. And what you want to do is get one bolt started first by hand and then go to the second bolt. This way you can adjust this to line it up easier with the second bolt, and also you make sure that you're not cross-threading them. You should be able to turn these in by hand pretty much all the way without much issue. If you have trouble turning them by hand, you're cross-threading them, just back out and redo it. Alright, and next you torque these down to your manufacturer's torque specifications. And on these metal parts, I like to use synthetic braking caliper grease. These are much better than your regular petroleum-based greases are. They're much more resistant to heat, and also they don't wash out when you drive in rain and whatnot. And when you're putting these on, just make sure you don't get any on your brake rotors. If you do, just wipe it down. You should be fine as long as you thoroughly clean it off. Alright, next we start to put in our brake pads, and you want to make sure you know where your brake wear indicator goes. Most times, and on this case, on this car, this brake indicator goes on the inside towards the top, which is your trailing edge on your brake rotor. But again, make a note of it when you're taking your old ones off so you know exactly where to put it. Alright, here's one of our brake pads. And here's the second one. Next, it's time to put on our brake caliper. But before we do that, we're going to apply our synthetic grease to the contact areas where this brake caliper is going to come into contact with our brake pads, which is the top of the piston and then these two areas. Next we get our caliper and slide it on like this. Next we put in our bolts. We do them one at a time so we make sure we're not cross-threading them, and also you want to run it a couple of turns then do the other one. Alright, something to look out for before you put in your bolts, and that is you want to line this slide pin with you want to line it up with your brake caliper. So you could put this the other way. It's not going to be flush, but if you haven't done this job before, you're not going to pay attention to that, and you're going to put it in your bolts, and then you're going to run into trouble. But you know, you got to watch out for these things. There's a little groove, I guess you could call it, underneath here on the brake caliper itself that you need to line this up with. That way you get it nice and flush. Then you put in your bolts. Alright, next you torque him down. And that's all there is to it, folks. Just removing those 4 bolts, cleaning our brake parts, reapplying grease, and just making sure we follow direction and put everything back together the same way we took it off. So now we're just going to repeat the same thing on the other side, and then we should be good to go. So with that said, hope this video helps people out there. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up. Also, you might want to consider viewing some of my other videos. I'll put them up on the screen as video links so you can just click on them. Alright, thanks for watching. See you next time.